All right.
All right, welcome to SIG Architecture Community Meeting for Thursday, October 12th, 2017. I am your host, co-lead of this SIG, Jason Singer-DeMars. And if you want to follow along after the fact, we have the agenda available for your perusal at bit.ly/sig-architecture. And I encourage you to sign into the document now if you're attending, which I'm doing myself. And let people know that you're attending. We don't have much of an agenda today. Brian, our co-host, is not available today. So I did have one thing that I put in there regarding a proposal that is not an architecture proposal per se, but what it does is it dovetails with the KEP proposal such that KEPs can be implemented in a way that makes sense. And so I'd love for people to review this and make pithy comments and whatever else is necessary to make this something that'll work for us. But in a nutshell, essentially trying to drag some nice scaled agile development practices into our community so that we can better deliver on some of the things that we commit to, and also have a way of managing the implementation lifecycle around KEPs, because KEPs inherently sort of change the way that we think about value added into the ecosystem. Instead of the more traditional features, as in, something that's traditionally thought of as user-facing or some community-facing, value could be delivered in the form of any number of things. So it's really a different way to think about how we add and enhance the overall ecosystem. So just briefly, I did put a link to the proposal in the agenda if you want to look at it in your spare time, more good bathroom reading. Essentially, this is the implementation arm of the KEP. It reinforces the governance model around SIGs being the keepers of their own features documentation backlog, but it does provide critical oversight for product management, architecture, and other program level SIGs. And essentially, there's a planning event that is attended by a support role that we're going to create for each SIG that's called a product owner. Anybody familiar with Agile probably knows about product owners, and that it's a way to sort of provide team-level access to the customer voice. So product owners are sort of a direct delegate from the product management, and in our case, it'll probably be SIG architecture as well. And help sort of ensure alignment over time with what's being done at the sort of team / weekly, monthly level and the long-term arc of Kubernetes. So then, so like I said, it creates support roles instead of asking SIGs to attend product management meetings, because that has been a notorious waste of time for people, and it hasn't actually been very effective. So that short circuits that. Essentially, feature freeze is not a thing anymore. It really happens after we have a planning event that occurs during the code freeze. So during code freeze of 1.8, we would have a planning session for 1.9, and that would primarily be product owners and SIG delegates to talk about what they're going to commit to, what overlaps, interdependencies, what are the things that can go wrong during the cycle that might make people miss their commitments. And then at the end of that, you have a committed plan for the next release. And obviously things change, but for example, if somebody comes in midway through the cycle and didn't do planning and wants to just put something in as far as a KEP that maybe is out in the wings and not implemented, they would go through some sort of exception process on that to make sure that that's not inhibiting some other team's work or whatever that is. So essentially, feature freeze is sort of becomes a non-issue, because if you're not planning to work and you're not implementing work, what are you doing? That's not a good pattern for us to follow as a community. And then basically, the further take that one step out is that the concept of features and features repo and all that is completely deprecated. We don't really have features. It's not like that anymore. We're not filling in giant gaping holes in terms of Kubernetes functionality. We're really fine-tuning and honing the ecosystem and working with a beautiful set of primitives that we have in place that provide a tremendous amount of value. So our role in architecture is to continue adding value from an architecture perspective and make sure that when we're doing planning for releases, if we're going to deprecate something or move a repo, that's part of the planning process. So we are become first-class citizens in what has traditionally been a sort of feature-oriented world, and that's something that will give us a lot of leverage. So essentially, KEPs describe the value, and this process delivers it. So that is it in a nutshell. Any questions?
So one of the things that I'm struggling with is this idea of product ownership in an open source world. Mm-hmm. I don't view personally Kubernetes as a product, it's a project. It doesn't have and so there are places, and so the whole idea of product ownership, and it seems like it's much more suited to a top-down hierarchical type of structure. Whereas open source to some degree is a bunch of people finding common ground and then contributing where it makes sense, or coordinating where it makes sense, and then doing their own thing where it doesn't make sense.
I totally agree, and that actually was, as I was going through this process, I had a little bit of heartburn around the product owner label, because really what it is basically somebody. I mean, it's combining like the Scrum Master role, so somebody helps untangle blocks, and it's somebody who is sort of a delegate to the product management competency, and it's somebody who's basically got their eye partly on architecture. So but in the end, I mean, if we want to build a product, and I think Kubernetes is a product. Kubernetes has a user base, and it has a life cycle. It has deprecations. It has policies. It has a governance model now. I mean, essentially, we want to be able to encapsulate customer voice as low a level as possible, so we're not building like the Winchester Mansion. We need to be focused in how we direct our efforts, and companies, like ours. I mean, Heptio is well funded, but you guys have to be careful about how you invest your money and time into Kubernetes. I mean, that's a really big deal. And if you're busy doing something that you do a bunch of PRs for, and it gets dropped, that's a significant impact to your company and everybody else's. So we got to be careful about that.
One of my thoughts on this, like to kind of echo Joe, is OpenStack had product manager. Linux does not have product managers. Are we trying to be more like OpenStack in how we approach the features that go into the project, or are we trying to be like Linux, where there is a general give and tug, or given push and pull among a variety of interests? Because I do think that is one of the things that when people look at OpenStack and some of the challenges that OpenStack has, is that it is very product focused. I feel like there's a little something dangerous about going too far down that path. Not that there can't be value in trying to treat some parts of the project like a product, but at the same time, like then if you can make those decisions like about what features and product things have to be done, you do run into challenges with you force a lot more things to have to be done in the Kubernetes project than might necessarily be healthy to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid concern. So let me address it as I've seen it. First of all, I would say that the product management SIG and the activities that the product management SIG does, and the whole features repo and all that stuff, is the worst kind of incarnation of what you just said. I feel like the world we're living in right now, where the SIGs have to do all this work around product management and keep things updated in the issue, and then there's a spreadsheet and all that. I understand the spirit of that, and I understand why people have wanted to do that. But that has now become a liability. It is not actually helping us; it is hindering us. So what I did in my conception around this was to not throw out the baby with the bathwater. to acknowledge that especially with pretty much everybody who matters being on board with the CNCF, this has a tremendous amount of gosh, I don't know how to say this other than just, I guess I'll say it, organizational bias, that for companies to want to invest in this and continue investing in it and supporting it, that there has to be some tiny semblance of something that they understand in the organizational model around it. So what I try to do is think of ways that we can empower SIGs through support roles and not try and make SIGs be accountable to anybody. So basically, this is distributing the product management directly to the SIGs and saying, we're not just going to throw you to the wolves and say, now you have to manage your own backlog, you have to untangle your own dependencies across SIGs, you have to figure out how to get cross SIG visibility yourself. It's not any of that. It's like, we're gonna backstop your effort by trying to provide a role to you that is a support role, a help role, that is not, there's no authority in it. There's no control in it. It's simply just a way for people to get together and talk about, what are we going to do in the next release? How do we ensure that there's not dependencies cross SIGs that are going to hamstring us halfway through the release, so that we're investing a bunch of money in wasted coding time and product time? So it's really more that. And if there's a better way to describe it, I'm all for it. But I mean, in a sense, that this is a hybrid role of sort of the agile enablement.
Well, I wrote down some thoughts as you were talking here in terms of a better way to describe what we want here. And I think there's really three things that we need to do. And I think this is more in line with an open source project. The first one is boundaries. We need to define what Kubernetes is and isn't, and give clear boundaries in a way to actually let people know early on when something is out of scope for Kubernetes. And then I wrote down attractors here, but like there's certain things and priorities that we want to actually encourage people to actually invest in. Now, we can't force anybody to do anything, but what we can do is we can say, hey, if you're going to be working on this, you're going to have an easier time. You're going to get more priority in terms of people reviewing your stuff. You're going to get more attention, right? And it's more of a carrot than a stick type of model. And then the third one is communication, and that's really what the KEPs are about. Who's doing what, when, and where. And it's going to be messy and it's going to be slow, but that's, I think, the nature of open source versus something that is much more top down. Now, you talked about Heftio's investment in Kubernetes, and I want to draw attention to, like, when we've been making investments in the Kubernetes ecosystem, I think, like a lot of folks, we've been as much as possible looking to make investments outside of the Kubernetes /Kubernetes, right? We want to do highly leveraged thing there. We know it's going to take a lot longer. I think the best thing we can do is enable people to actually experiment outside of the official repo here. One example here is, and I'm torn on this also, is that, like, we've been talking about this application definition stuff through SIG CLI, and there's going to be a working group that we're forming that we're going to send mail about. Brian has some very, very specific thoughts there. And he's starting to prototype and sort of evangelize those thoughts, and that's great. He is checking in code, or the Google folks are checking in code into Kubernetes /kubeconfig to actually experiment with his ideas. From the Heftio point of view, we started this whole project outside of Kubernetes called KSonnet. We're continuing to iterate there, figure out what makes sense. And my hope is that if we can prove that stuff out, and we got work to do, believe me, we got work to do to prove that stuff out, then it'll actually earn its place to move closer into core. And I think we've seen the similar things happen with other projects that have started more on the periphery and have become more and more of a part of the ecosystem over time. And in my mind, that's a healthier model than the sort of like top-down hierarchical, this is the way we're going to solve it for everybody. We really have to embrace the bizarre here. In terms of, letting a lot of projects experiment, find the stuff that the community supports, and then adapting what works, instead of actually trying to plan this stuff out from the get-go. And so again, I view it again more like the Linux kernel versus a product. And then finally, you mentioned the CNCF. I think the biggest thing, like there is a danger from all of the attention that Kubernetes and the CNCF is getting in terms of tons and tons of people wanting to pour resources, want to make themselves heard, wanting to, and I see this in terms of like, people's performance reviews actually hinging on the fact that they need to be a SIG lead, or people are like, if I can't get this project into Kubernetes incubator, then I'm going to miss my goals for the quarter, right? That stuff is unhealthy, and I think the best thing we can do is to essentially, as much as possible, lock down what Kubernetes is and try and say no to that stuff. Now, this is, I think, probably a larger discussion for the steering committee. But with respect to this process here, my gut here is that we just want to be a little bit more sort of embrace the messiness to some degree, and we just like concentrate on communication. All right, I'll shut up for a while. Sorry.
Yeah, Joe. I was just going to say I agree with you a lot on this, because I'll just go back to an example we know. Deployment Manager used to be part of Kubernetes, and Helm came as part of the ecosystem, and just naturally something that was developed out in the ecosystem ended up becoming the model that ended up winning. And that's just where people gravitated. We don't necessarily know what that is, and so we should let experimentation happen wherever and cultivate it rather than try to force something in there. And then if something turns out to be really great, then fold it in and come up with a way to kind of enable that ecosystem. Like you said with Incubator, people want to get their stuff into Incubator because that's when they see it's really coupled to Kubernetes. And there's just this kind of, if I want it to be true, it's got to be incubated, because we don't have another way to highlight that ecosystem. There's put it on an awesome list. I'm sorry, that doesn't really cut it. That's the advice that was given to me. Just get it on an awesome list, and it's going to be, then people know it's part of the ecosystem and it's great. That's not true. We need a way to kind of highlight what's going on in the community and the ecosystem, and to elevate that and to show it off. And we don't have that capacity now, which kind of forces everyone to say, get it in a Kubernetes org, then it's official. And you do that through incubation. And so we kind of need to round out some of this that lets the messiness happen. And then we can see what rises to the top in that. And I do think it's really important that we figure out what is Kubernetes, because, I've talked to a few different people on the steering committee, and they've given me different opinions on what Kubernetes is, which means it's really hard to communicate that. One of the diagrams that I created said, here's core, and then here's Kubernetes ecosystem versus other, and I've got a lot of pushback on this, but what really is that we could put into a picture that we can convey to people? And that isn't decided. Now, I realize that's more for the steering committee, but it's hard to build a process to embrace the messiness if we can't even decide on what is Kubernetes.
I think we've drifted a bit from the earlier point. I think that is a great point, Matt. And I was just talking to an OpenStack contributor at Metainerati on Tuesday about this. That OpenStack really did a great job about allowing people to experiment, but that RefStack came far too late to allow users to actually know what OpenStack was and to have workloads be portable between different distributions of OpenStack. But I think we were really trying to nail down what product management means. And Jace comes from an Agile background, as do I, and so this means what service are you providing both the teams and the users of what your team produces. And whether you want to call that a product, or I guess I would call this a program, I think is fine. But just figuring out what we're looking for in terms of responsibilities, I think may be important before we talk about, before we get too far in the weeds there.
Yeah, I think thank you, Kil. That's yeah. Everything that was said after, Matt's comments and Joe's comments as well, those are not in any way mutually exclusive to what this proposal is. In fact, they're very complementary. The thing that if we commit to something that we want to get done, the worst thing we can do is just hope that it's going to get done and have no any kind of boundaries about tracking it or understanding it or whatnot, because frankly, there are a lot of things that are predicates for other things in flight. And so that's going to definitely be true for us in architecture, right? So, I see the cloud providers as a perfect example of this, that those have to get out of tree for other things to happen. So there's things that have to happen in an orderly way. And then there's things that I want to see all sorts of scribbling and like crazy things happening. And that's the ecosystem outside of core. And so what we're talking about is trying to let's make the things that we need to countable, and let's make the things that are wild and fun and crazy and not necessarily so accountable. Those should continue the way they are, and building those strong competitors on the periphery. I mean, I think K-Sonnet and Sonobuoy are both great examples of that. I mean, those are going to become inseparable from the ecosystem, just like Helm. So, but let me say in really blunt terms here that we are at a huge risk point right now with the way product management is happening right this second. So it's great to define what is Kubernetes and everybody's saying kumbaya about it. But while that's happening, we are alienating our SIGs. We are creating a process that is hard for contributors to follow. And frankly, we're wasting a lot of valuable time from people filling out things that aren't delivering any value, that are making this product and project and everything else, the program, harder to deal with from a contributor standpoint. So what I'm trying to say is, let's stop the bleeding. We're going to do the KEP process. Let's take the KEP process and have some sort of way of translating those critical pieces of value that we define into actionable things. Let's make sure that we're being wise about how we do that and not doing a bunch of dependencies and just ignoring that there's things that have dependencies on other things when we're doing planning. And let's try and commit to a couple of things. And if we don't, then that's great. But at least let's give it a shot. That seems reasonable to me.
So a couple of questions, Jace. So
sure.
Things that are like, there's going to be things that we have to nag people about no matter what. So
yes,
like release notes aren't going to write themselves, and release notes aren't going to be consistent without people encouraging and enforcing that. I don't think the answer is that one person writes all the release notes. So like there's the KEP at one end. KEPs are fairly easy to argue about because they represent big arcs.
Yep.
And then release notes maybe at the other end kind of represent one of the small arcs.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that there will still be some need for the badgering for release notes. Is there a disagreement around that?
Oh, there will not be if this is done right. Because KEPs translate to issues. Issues have metadata and fields like a template, just like any other, for the work that needs to get done. It has to be work that can be actionable. And then to set that up as a template that can be scraped should be trivial. And I've already talked to Mark about this even.
Okay, maybe I'm just overly cynical about there's kind of, because the KEPs, like, there are hundreds of issues that go into every Kubernetes release that mostly deserve release notes that cross that line that aren't KEPs. And so that's what I'm just trying to tease apart where you see that difference in, we have to document every API change. And that's not an API change that goes out that breaks someone that we drop the ball on documenting is us going back on our promises as a community.
Right. Yeah, no, you have a very good point there. Caleb, you had something you're going to add because you're the KEP guy. So.
Yeah, I did, and I guess as I was looking at the KEP process, wearing a SIG or release team hat and PM group hat, and I guess at least to me, I've never bought that you wouldn't know more or less, at least have a draft of what you would put in release notes when you were just begin implementing what you were working on. At least not if you worked at one of these large sponsoring companies where you have a internal planning process where your manager told you to work on something because it's important to the company. And so the documentation or tech writers from SIG docs are wanting to get involved in the documentation process. As a new enhancement or functionality is being proposed. And so I think I would like to see a process where the KEPs themselves formed a lot of that sourcing material for the draft release notes, for the draft blog post. And so they're working with the documentation team to make that actually possible, rather than having to chase. I mean, yes, there's always going to be things that slip through the cracks, but definitely getting most or much of the documentation done first, I think, is one of the goals of the KEPs, at least for me.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I see it as a 65% solution, but not 100% solution. So I was curious as to how you guys felt that overlap was. Because I know lots of issues that would never get a KEP that deserve release notes and vice versa. as well as KEPs that the release notes are much more specialized than we're adding storage metrics, great high level. The actual practical usually doesn't emerge until the very end because it's not a waterfall process. What about product owner? So are you not concerned, Jace, on the product owner arc that this looks a little bit like the same thing but different?
The same thing but different.
Same thing as SIG PM, right? It's somebody who owns SIG storage and the act of assigning an owner. I have some, and I may not concerns, but that definitely seems like an area where we're talking about things that we were concerned about for SIG leads, right? SIG leads being arbiters and ultimate deciders. Does a product owner have to be a decider in that same vein?
A product owner is only given as much power to make decisions or whatnot as the SIG gives them. I mean, this is the thing, is that product management, this is a blanket statement. There may be examples where this is not true, but in my opinion, as a general, product management should never be able to tell a SIG to do anything. Architecture probably can, because there are things, the guidelines and whatnot that should be done. But I mean, SIGs should be the masters of their own destiny. So a product owner, again, is really about enabling the SIG to do the work they need to do. So the product owner should be in communication with other SIGs when features have dependencies. I mean, I could see SIG node and SIG storage having those two product owners having conversations about how to unblock a particular thing, or maybe something needs to get reviewed. And the product owner is simply just a pipeline into a certain viewpoint of the work the SIG is doing.
So, I mean, maybe the problem is naming management and owner.
Yeah, I'd call them whatever you want. Yes, we can call them whatever that is. I would gladly change it, but there's a lot of in an agile world, what the product owner does that I could see this being really important too.
Yeah, and I mean, agile. I mean, for the most part, agile is it is not an organic process that emerges from open source projects. It is a process that, at least my somewhat biased view, it's used effectively in companies. I haven't seen a lot of open source communities that work in the agile product owner sense, because the product owners are typically the people who are very motivated to set the direction for the project, which are typically, this varies, but like an OpenStack, I would say the leads on individual projects in OpenStack, in a sense, did some of the project owner or the product owner style responsibilities. And they were getting input from a number of sources. That was at least from my perspective, was a point of tension in the OpenStack community. SIG lead was the lead of an individual component was a very important position. And so we kind of tried to arc away with that. So naming might be pretty important in how we approach this.
I would love to not run afoul of any known anti-patterns from that. I mean, let's not repeat that. But the thing is that I also don't want to say, well, Agile doesn't work for open source and it's too top down. I completely disagree. I think that it's all about how you implement it, because I've seen it in huge projects where essentially when you get into some of these companies that are so massive that they ostensibly become like open source projects, where there's teams that work together that have never even talked to each other. There are plenty of ways in which that can be used as an information point in the process too. So I don't want to just, again, assume that it's not going to work, because it hasn't. There are things about this that can allow it to work extremely well, but let's not. I don't want to be dogmatic about anything. What I want to say is we have a need. This is a need that we need to fix. Here's a way to do it that is nobody else seems to be proposing anything about how to get us out of this current bind. So I feel like that this has been, a way to approach that, and I want to fine tune it and tailor it so that it works for the community.
Jace, first of all, thanks for actually taking a shot at this. Okay, so I want to make sure that gets out there.
I feel the same way too. Jace, don't treat this as it wasn't worth.
Yeah. So definitely, I mean, it's a discussion that we need to be having. I don't think anybody here is let's stick with the status quo. Okay, I think it's clear that we need to find ways to improve this. We need to find ways to make the process less frustrating, more transparent, and more effective. So I think those goals are all aligned. And so, yeah, I mean, please don't take this as being like everything's fine. There's not a problem here. And so thanks for stepping up here.
No, I appreciate that. Thanks. And if I'm frustrated, it's because I sometimes, when you have ideas in your head and it's so hard sometimes to fully articulate those, it's like, my head's going to explode. But I might ask for a little bit of trust on this to have my own experiment with this a little bit, or to ask for help to try and find a way to experiment with this. My gut tells me that there's a way to make this work and work really well.
Well, I mean, let me tell you sort of my impressions here, and this isn't fair, and so I'm going to preface it with that. The SIG PM meetings have been at a time where I can't attend them. And so from somebody from the outside who can't go to those meetings, what it feels like is it's a bunch of folks who've been assigned by big companies who are sitting around telling the rest of the project what to do. That's the impression, and it comes down with these edicts of like every SIG will send somebody to this meeting, you must do that, right? And I think that in true developer fashion, a lot of the reaction there has either been hostile or passive aggressive. And the passive aggressive is that people just don't play ball and they check stuff in anyways, right? Yep. So I think a big part of it is that right now that product management role doesn't feel like it's actually servicing the rest of the project, or at least that's my impression. And again, because I haven't been able to go to those meetings because of a timing conflict, I may have a skewed impression of that. But I think, in terms of naming, in terms of crafting and communicating this process, making sure that it comes across as a way of like, how do we actually help the project and help the SIGs be successful versus tell them what to do. And maybe it's as simple as something like naming. I don't know.
Yeah. No, you're 100% like exactly what you said. And the thing is, I want to be careful too, because the people who are in SIG PM, the people who have spent a lot of time working on that, have done a very valuable service. And this is the thing that I feel like we're at this tipping point as a project where, and I felt it at the SIG leadership thing especially, like there's this pivot point that has to happen. It happens with every startup, it happens with every growth company, where basically you have to there's some line you cross where you're thinking more about maintaining than you are building. And so when you're in more of a maintenance mode, you're thinking about sustainability. How do you create things that are enduring and lasting? And you think about the life cycle of features and how to serve your community, and you have this success out there. I feel like Kubernetes is really at that point. So a lot of these things are just standard growing pains about, a really great product team did fantastic things for 1.3 and 1.4 and 1.5, and then maybe a little less in 1.6 and even less in 1.7. And 1.8, it actually was like now causing strife and struggle. So it's like, let's learn from that. Let's mature the process and figure out how to move forward. And I welcome comments on this document. I welcome anybody to meet with me privately and talk about it. Let's craft it, hone it. But I do believe the kernel, the sort of the hard pit of this cherry is something that has the ability to serve the community in a very significant way. So that's my not so quick overview. Oy.
So Jace, you want feedback and comment, and by the next SIGARC meeting, we should be able to concretely talk about this.
Yeah, that would be splendid.
That sounds great. Thanks for putting it together, Jace.
Yeah, for sure.
And this definitely feels like something that stretches across SIG architecture and beyond. So conversation doesn't start around here for sure.
Yeah, no, and I've already done this pitch to SIG PM, and they were actually very receptive. That nobody is thinking that the way we're doing it right now is great. So we're just doing the best we can. Hey, Quentin, did you have anything that you wanted to add to the agenda? Because I know you're kind of going to take a look at it asynchronously. Was there anything that you wanted to run by?
No. I was. Sorry, you take a look at your document asynchronously, or take a look at something else asynchronously?
No, there was a thread basically about the SIG architecture backlog and sort of things that we wanted to discuss for this meeting, and I just wondered if you had anything that you specifically...
No, I undertook, I hope there wasn't any confusion. Before the next week meeting was what I undertook to do, not something at a few hours' notice.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So this is typically the alternating one is the office hours, where we don't have a formal agenda. We just sort of riff on things. So this one's sort of, if we need to make a decision or whatnot, typically that would be during this time. So.
Okay. Yeah. I undertook to do the stuff that Brian said he would not be able to do by the end of next week.
That's really kind of you. Thank you very much. Okay. Is there anything anybody else has to add to the agenda?
I mean, I'd like to try and move the ball forward a little bit on the KEP process. I think, I made some changes that Brian checked in there. I want to make sure that, none of that stuff is final yet. I want to make sure that we discuss it and folks see what's going on there, especially Caleb. And I don't know if you've had time to dig in this a little bit. In my mind, the next step forward here is getting to the point where we have general agreement on the template and the sort of process instructions for this stuff, and then and that is, and there's I think some of it is like, what is the state and the flow for a KEP, and I think there's probably a little bit of work to be done there that we need to reconcile. There's a big process there, I think, around how do we assign, what are we calling them, like editors or shepherds, essentially sort of people to actually help these things move forward. And how do we do that through the eyes of sort of, we're going to have limited capacity for this stuff, right? It's not going to be an unlimited type of thing. And so I think there's a prioritization going on there. And so that's got to be part of the process also.
Yeah.
And then, go ahead, Caleb.
No, sorry. I'll let you finish.
Yeah, and then the last thing is that, like, do we want to open up this idea of, like, whole project KEPs versus per SIG KEPs as a one way to sort of maybe, unlock more bandwidth here? Because when something is relatively confined to a SIG, they may want to use this process for their own, organization. But is there a way to essentially let that run without, activating all of the sort of, bandwidth across this SIG and editor bandwidth and all that? So those were some of the things I was thinking there.
Yeah, I had something which I added to the review at the time, and I'm not exactly sure what happened to it. I think it was kind of semi-ignored because it was one of those disruptive comments, and I didn't want to hold up the works and like prevent the merge happening or whatever. But the one concern that I had was that we seem to be, with that proposal, trying to do two quite distinct things. The one of which is to kind of ensure technical integrity of the product, i.e., get a sense of all of the needs in the, I won't say product, project, and make sure that they're all kind of being bumped into a coherent direction so that there's not too much dissonance from a technical point of view and from a product point of view. And then the other thing we're trying to do is kind of communicate what's happening, which almost comes after the fact. And that's, release notes and all of the stuff around the release and everything there. And it seemed like we might have kind of mashed those two together. And it sort of seemed like it might be useful to kind of tease them apart and say, here's the, very specifically, maintaining technical integrity of the product is a goal, and these are the specific steps to achieve that goal. And then communicating what's happening so that people can know that release 1.7 has got feature X, Y, and Z in it seemed like a completely different goal. There's some degree of overlap there. And I didn't think that came across particularly well in that document. It might have changed significantly since I read it, but I don't think so.
Well, one of the changes that I made that I don't think we got as much input from Caleb as I would have liked was to essentially take out the references to the release process and the release notes. And so, not saying that we don't need a formal process there and that we don't have problems around that, but I had the same feeling that you did, Quentin, that we were trying to actually cover too much ground, both on this sort of long arc. What is the case law for what the architecture is for Kubernetes, which is what this stuff will become over time, and then what is happening on a day-to-day basis, or release to release basis. Seemed like two separate problems, but they are related. So yeah. Caleb,
Yeah, they just seem, if you try and solve both of them together and you don't recognize that they're semi-separate but related, it just becomes like a much more difficult problem to solve, I think. Whereas if you solve them somewhat more, or at least solve the first one, which I think you can somewhat solve the first one without considering the second one too much, and then you can, use the output of the first one to solve the second one, kind of thing.
So I guess I have purposely tried to think about these two, and I entirely agree, two separate problems and address them with one process. Because I don't think I think we are moving too quickly now to consider them as two problems that we'll solve separately or one after solving the other. I don't think we can do that now at the scale of the project. At least in my personal experience as someone who is called upon internally and for media interviews to talk about what was going on in the project itself, it is no longer reasonable to do so with the existing primitives we have for project management for the project. And I think that's a very dangerous place for the project to drift into from a sustainability standpoint. Like if we can't communicate and all easily have the same source of information for when we're communicating about what's going on in the project, I guess the fragmentation in marketing and communication concerns me quite a bit, at least looking at how that has gone in other large platform projects. It's not a place I want to be in. And so I wanted to look
I don't personally disagree with the need to do that well, and maybe I miscommunicated. I absolutely agree. I just think that is somewhat of a different process than the technical decisions that need to be made on an ongoing basis to ensure that the shape of the product moves in the right direction over time. And communicating those decisions might be part of what you're talking about, but actually surfacing the information that's required by the people making those decisions, like SIG architecture, and making sure that they all get to the right place and that the process is there to make sure that the right decisions get taken, seems different than communicating it to the outside world.
I think you can consider them to be different. I don't personally consider them to be different enough to have distinct processes, at least ones that don't draw from the same underlying idea of what a unit of work is, or where that information is communicated. But I do agree that they are separate, I guess, challenges. But I do think that you need a process that ties these two things together. And I think that has been at least how I've approached the whole process proposal thing. But I don't disagree that they're the two different challenges. But if you are making a technical decision, I guess the motivation is often lost or it's hard to find about why you decided a technical decision was required in the first place, and getting that information stored someplace so you can look at it later and communicate about why it was important, I think is crucial for a project that is supposed to enable others to write software against the APIs, run software against using these APIs. So at least in terms of the developer and operator personas that we're trying to support here, I think we need to do a much better job about explaining why the technical changes we're making at the SIG architecture level, or even more narrowly in an individual SIG, are important. A lot of this stuff, happens in these hallway conversations at large corporations, and I just want to pull this stuff into the light because we are an open source project, and I think it's important to have all of those decisions and rationales stored somewhere for posterity. And posterity may even be like us, like 2 quarters from now. At least my memory is not perfect. But.
So I think we're in probably 90% agreement here. I think getting the important decisions documented in a way that is accessible and easy to communicate, I think, is the overarching goal here. I think the disconnect here is, how does this actually relate to decisions versus work done? and the decisions may take multiple releases to actually sort of come to fulfillment, right? Like think about the work around, refactoring the Go packages out of the mono repo, right? That's an ongoing thing that's going to take a long time. I wish we had a cap on that, right? Because feels like that's the type of thing that would benefit from wide communication and some discussion and some understanding of the why about that. Because my suggestion is that the API machinery folks are getting tired of explaining this. But what's happening on a release by releases basis is different. Now I could see that, like, oftentimes, like at the beginning of the release, having a summary saying like we've made this progress on these KEPs would be a part of the release, and then people could actually go and read those things to see the bigger arc of where things are happening. So in my mind, these things are definitely related, and there's tools, and it's going to enhance the change happening process. But in my mind, the KEP stuff is a longer arc.
Well, this sort of gets into the part of the rationale around why I was approaching the problem the same way I was, is that in theory, you should be able to have a steel thread between a KEP to a single commit, and that should be easy. So it should be KEP is a merged, basically a merged PR proposal, right? Where it has metadata that gets sort of updated over time. And that corresponds to a number of issues that are labeled with a milestone, that are marked milestone approved, that are trackable and then tied back to merges that have that issue as a reference. So, I mean, literally, you could pick up any commit that ties to a KEP and click on it and literally click your way through to the KEP and make that super easy. Like, oh, I get how this commit actually ties to this. And so that's the whole idea behind managing the sort of the backlog that way.
And I guess I'm also approaching it with the tautology in mind that in an open source project, what got done is what got done. And so I would like to be able to look at those pull requests that have gone in for a particular release, and then, like Jason's saying, tie them back to a motivation as why that commit was important to make. And like, yes, an effort may run over one or multiple releases. And I think it's important to have a process for tracking that work over one or multiple releases.
Yeah, I think, and that, that makes good use of the milestone, right? Because it essentially, if you think of the KEP spread over 3 releases, you're going to have the first series of issues tied to work pull requests that emerged for milestone 1.8, and then the next batch for 1.9, and then 1.10, and over time you get to see, wow, we did 7 issues over the course of this KEP. 2 of those were in 1.8, 2 of those were in 1.9, and then 1 was in the next or whatever. And then those, fanned out to 50 PRs for the one release and 10 for the next. So it's going to help you see over time how these things get implemented, and it's a method of managing the work that is enduring and makes sense and is completely trackable via version control, which is really important.
So I mean, I could imagine that, like, some releases, there'll be a release note that says fully implement, KEP 1, 2, 3, right? And it'll be done in one release, and you link back to that KEP and there you go. I imagine in other cases it'll be like, we did X, Y, Z towards implementing KEP 1, 2, 3. One of the nice things about having the KEP process, at least when it comes to collecting release notes, there is, like, you can poke somebody who says, look, there's a bunch of things that were done towards this KEP. Can you summarize all those issues into one release note item instead of actually trying to synthesize it? And there's a name that is, and some folks that are on the hook for essentially owning the release note for that particular KEP.
Yeah, and this, to Caleb's important point about how we communicate about this, that when it's just like, Stephen Hawking, right? He writes about these really mind-blowing things, but he does it in a way that you can understand it. And if you want to dig into, how this affects, things at a mathematical level, you can. But if somebody's trying to explain these at a very coarse level to somebody, from Tech Target or whatever, you can just talk about the KEP and say, we made significant progress toward X, Y, and Z in this process. And that's just as valid a way of describing the work as going down and looking at the merge level. And mic drop.
I think Quentin dropped the mic for you.
Yeah, he did.
I'd love. I mean, if other folks have thoughts on this, I'd love to hear it. I don't think there's a silver bullet here, and I totally am sympathetic to Caleb's desire to make the release note stuff and make the communication be as sort of automagic as possible. So yeah.
Well, or at least automagicable.
Yeah, automagicable. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can tell you the interviews that I was in for 1.8 release, like with the press, were very, very uncomfortable. Yeah, let's not put anybody. I don't want to put poor Anthony or whoever release managers of the future in that same position of having to try and market speak their way around things that have
Wait. So the release manager ends up being a press facing role?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It turns out it's awful.
Yeah, it's super awful.
That's an unpleasant part of that job. That's already unpleasant. God.
But that doesn't necessarily sound like such a good idea, to be honest. I mean, no criticism of your press face, Jace. But it seems
different skill set, though.
Right. A sufficiently different skill set requirement.
And I totally agree with that, Quentin. We need to do a much better job briefing the press about the structure of the project and who they need to be talking to understand what's going on. But we don't have that today.
Right.
We tried with this version of the release notes to have SIGs introduce themselves to the wider community and try to build that understanding. But like we're so far from that now that the press is just funneled towards the release team, which becomes a huge amount of unscoped work. Right.
Well, I
have done a Herculean effort to get the release out.
I would say, and I actually disagree, that I think that in how we conceptualize the release lead role, the release lead should be somebody who is more of an organizational leader and less of somebody who's like got their head in the bits. Like it is a very demanding, large program level effort to get the release out currently, and that person should be able to speak to the press, and that I think that's a fair thing to ask. What I don't want to see is what almost happened this time, where marketing was going and talking about release level themes that we had already in the process of the release said, let's declare bankruptcy on this because there are no release level themes. And so they sort of were inventing, manufacturing things about the release that weren't even true. So, and not only not true, but they were things that were counter to what SIGs were trying to get across in their own work. So it was like,
or provably false.
Yes. So what I don't want to see is that. I'd rather see somebody who has a little bit more of a tactical view speak to it than somebody who's so disconnected from the nuts and bolts of it that they're actually manufacturing things that didn't happen. So I think that a release lead that is more of a program manager, it makes sense. And I think that is good for the community too.
I think it's good for the community too, but it would be nice to have, like someone like Michelle talking about why the workloads graduation is so important from a technical point of view for someone who is, writing or running large workloads on top of Kubernetes, or like talking about how the CRI is a great place for vendors interested in interacting with Kubernetes, or Saw talking about how CSI is going to allow Big Co to, ship out to integrate their super expensive storage appliance with Kubernetes without having to land something in a tree. But I think there's room for both.
Agreed. Well, I think that as we move forward, that it's a multi-pronged marketing effort, right? We have all this great detailed technical implementation stuff, and SIGs should be driving those. That's the thing. I think the SIGs should care enough about what they're delivering to want to promote it and to push it and to get it out there. And that, I think that these are all things that we need to enable in SIGs and help them across the line with these things, not just throw them to the wolves on it.
Quick question though, because they're thrown to the wolves. How many SIG leads are going to be comfortable getting in front of press or other people to talk about the technicality? Now, I know SIG apps were probably different. Michelle, Adnan, and I are probably all pretty comfortable doing that. But can all the SIGs say that?
Not necessarily, but I don't think it's a role that needs to be just the SIG lead. I think anyone in a SIG should be empowered to be able to speak about work that was done by the SIG, and we need to have the structure that allows anyone to do that. mean, any SPOF is a SPOF we can't tolerate, really. Single point of failure for people not, I guess. And I think certainly that we need someone to help find these people and connect them with the press and get them their media training. But yeah, I think that most SIGs, at least the SIGs we should be able to find someone within the SIG to talk about the work that they have delivered. I guess kind of, if you can't talk about it, why did you do it, is something, it was a question that comes to my mind.
Yeah. And I love that about the KEP thing too, that you know, it's the way of defining that value that people can talk about. Wow, we're at 12:30. This hour went remarkably fast. I don't even understand. There was a quick announcement, just real quick. 1.8.1 is out and has that fix in the conformance tests around ICMP. So some of the cloud providers, Azure, blocks ICMP, so it wasn't necessarily the best test for conformance for us. So that's been removed as a blocking test for conformance, and there's lots of other good bug fixes in there. Also need to fill more release team roles, as we saw. There's a link in the announcements to that. Anything else before we close?
I'm going to be trying to find some time to continue to sort of, submit some changes around the KEP process. I welcome anybody else who wants to review and commits on that. And, Caleb, that means especially you, because I know we're not totally lined up yet, but I want to continue down that path.
Yep.
Yeah, I can review as well if you want my input, which you might not.
Well, I mean, I definitely do. I guess personally, to comment that Derek made early in the process, maybe it's time to start trying to do like some kind of, can't see the scare quotes, but back testing the process on things we have already delivered into GA and things that are on their way into GA, and try and rough out or smooth some of these rough edges through that process.
I think, one way to soft launch it might be to be like, hey, the KEP process is advisory, but if you want to get a lot of eyes on something, if you want to actually sort of grease the skids, folks can opt into that. And without trying to sort of force it down everybody's throat, just to try and prime that pump. But we can talk about that later. We're out of time.
That was a lot of metaphors in one sentence, Joe. That was
I'm really good at that, by the way, mixing my metaphors. That's my specialty. But, that shift, that train has sailed. So,
all right.
And with that, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and see you at the community meeting in about 20 minutes or 30 minutes.
Cheers.
Bye.